Welcome back, folks. Mike here with the Social Life of Language, making complex theory simple but never simplified. Today we got something a little different. It's gonna be a pedagogical video explaining how I teach translanguaging theory using my illustration, my printable little cheat sheet. The links are down below. I'd also like to recognize 3 scholars who helped me finalize this. So thank you very much to Dr. Carla España, Dr. Laura Sensi Moreno, and Dr. Ofelia Garcia. Let's clarify who this video is for. And there are 2 main audiences. One audience will include educators who teach translanguaging theory. The other audience will include all the folks who are learning translanguaging theory right now, and you're totally overwhelmed with all the jargon and you have trouble explaining the differences between code switching and translanguaging and all the things. My illustration is meant to help you organize all that jargon in both a visual and a physical way. So printing out that chart and holding it in your hands, it's kind of part of the process. And in my courses, every student would eventually be holding this chart in their hands. But note, I would never just give students the chart. The class would be slowly constructing the chart over time. In fact, I have students drawing parts from memory all semester, and I make up games and competitions. Like if they can draw the diagram faster than me, they get a serious prize, like a high stakes prize. Any teacher knows that if you can get students screaming and yelling and laughing while learning stuff, you know you're probably doing something right. So this video will have 2 main chapters. In the first chapter, I'll talk you through the chart and how to use it as a teacher in class, or just solo at your desk. The second chapter of the video, though, is a bit more specialized. That part is for educators who are teaching translanguaging theory right now. And in that part of the video, I offer a suggested reading to presenting certain concepts that are on the illustration. Because like I said, this illustration is built over time. However, there is one main concept in particular that I teach at the very beginning of my course, which I imagine some will find unusual. Now, can you still watch the second part if you ain't a teacher? Yes, you might appreciate the suggested reading order to your own studying. Now keep in mind, I'm not claiming this is the right way to teach translanguaging theory. I'm just saying it's my way, it's Mike's way, not the right way. A couple things to know. I teach translanguaging theory almost every semester to undergrads and grad students using this exact same method, this same chart, and they get equally as deep. Using this cheat sheet helps get around a bunch of ways we get terminology mixed up. Because as teachers teaching translanguaging theory, we often have to borrow terminology from the code switching approach to explain stuff in the translanguaging approach. That's confusing. On top of that, sometimes we gotta explain how we teach to parents or principals and administrators who might not have any idea what the word translanguaging means. There are so many reasons why we get mixed up and stay mixed up in our understanding of some of these really deep keywords and concepts. Final note, something Ofelia Garcia told me to make super clear in this video. This simple illustration is only referring to the linguistic aspect of translanguaging theory. And that means we use the concept linguistic feature really often. This means, for pedagogical purposes that will become clearer later, we are focusing on the linguistic part of translanguaging, the linguistic part only, and not, let's say, multimodal forms of communication, multimodal forms of translanguaging. We aren't there yet. At this moment, we are only learning how to differentiate between code switching approaches and a translanguaging approach, what is on the chart, which means we are severely limiting a theory that is currently written across thousands of pages, probably hundreds of different authors, and we're reducing all of that to only one single cheat sheet. Plus, because there are only people's heads drawn on the diagram, this will give the impression that translanguaging theory is only about linguistic features, as though the concept language itself can or should be separated from our bodies and our identities. In the larger world of translanguaging theory, we are usually talking about the whole person that engages in languaging and not just quote unquote the linguistic feature. So just a reminder, we are only learning how to differentiate between code switching approaches and translanguaging approaches, primarily. It just so happens that this illustration can be used for so much more than that. With all that said, I'm gonna explain what I do and why I do it in different moments. So try to watch all the way through before getting judgy about my teaching, because admittedly, it's kind of weird, but it works for me and it works for my students. I want to start by giving you one of my two main pedagogical secrets to teaching my course, and they're both going to appear quite simplistic. Essentially, I present code switching and translanguaging as two parallel theories of language, as two parallel pedagogical approaches running side by side, as two approaches that almost don't even really have anything to do with one another. But Mike, translanguaging is meant to be political. You say as much in literally all of your videos. I know, just keep watching. Right now, as we learn, we are merely taking steps to organize our thoughts. All the keywords and concepts that exist on each side, we're just trying to organize them for clarity. I'm not suggesting that code switching and translanguaging don't directly conflict with one another. Of course they do. But to learn the differences in a nuanced way, my approach is to put them side by side and politically neutralize them while we work to clarify all the concepts and keywords that are floating around in each approach. So why do I do this? Well, it's actually inspired by like 20 seconds of an interview with Ofelia Garcia, and everything kind of clicked for me. And it would entirely change the way that I taught translanguaging theory. Let's see how she talks about herself developing translanguaging theory.
Rethink these things. And I think part of the tension then becomes the fact that people are right when they say, well, you talked about translanguaging as encompassing code switching, and I did. And it was because I had those concepts and then I overlaid the concept of translanguaging on top of it.
So when she described the early versions of her theory as kind of having been overlaid on top of code switching pedagogies, I suddenly understood why I kept getting confused, or why I kept trying to force concepts to mean the same thing, so to speak. Because what I would do at the beginning, I might accidentally conflate concepts together simply in an effort to try to remember all the different keywords. Or to speak metaphorically, I think what was happening was I kept getting confused by the keyword definitions that were positioned underneath translanguaging theory. And those definitions were always trying to break through. So when theories are placed on top of each other like that, for me, it set up this perpetual battle. Like I wanted translanguaging theory to stay on top because it was more ethical or progressive or futuristic, etc., etc. And this brings me to the two most common problems I've noticed when students are learning. It is the tendency at the very beginning for students to either, one, try to force code switching and translanguaging concepts to work together, and then slowly start conflating these things together by accident, like what I was doing when I was trying to remember all these different keywords. And then there's the other side of the spectrum, and this is when students want approaches to battle each other. As in, translanguaging is a better theory that describes what is happening in a better way. And if you're teaching a class full of activist teachers, they will very likely, very early on, try to prove translanguaging is a better way forward. Now, as a theorist, I'm like, yes, cool, I agree, absolutely. But that conversation is very distracting to have while you're also drowning in keywords and concepts. So sometimes I gotta remind myself and remind my students, right now, we're stepping back from the politics and just practicing utilizing all the keywords and concepts to the best of our ability using this illustration. And speaking of, let's talk about it. Whenever introducing translanguaging pedagogy, I'm talking the introductory lecture, right? I immediately present them with this perspectival metaphor to begin the process of separating code switching from translanguaging. I'll say, okay, students, imagine a mountain. Now imagine one person on one side of the mountain and one person on the other side of the mountain. Both are looking at the same mountain though, right? Maybe different things are seen as more important from one side of the mountain. Maybe different things are possible from this side of the mountain. Maybe one side of the mountain is too flat to ski on. Or maybe the other side is too steep for camping, but perfect for skiing. So both perspectives see different stuff. It's the same mountain, but they see different stuff and they see different possibilities. And here I say explicitly, neither perspective is better, just different. Now let's think of code switching and translanguaging similarly. Neither one is ethically better or worse. One's not old and outdated and the other is new and progressive. It's just two perspectives looking at the same thing. Obviously, this time the perspectives aren't looking at a mountain, they're looking at a language user. And let's say you have to interpret what one of your students is doing from each perspective. On the diagram, there is a dotted line right down the middle. The instructions say, fold it in half. Each side lets you see different things about the mountain, about the language user standing in front of you. You are either observing from the code switching perspective, or you go to the other side of the mountain and observe from the translanguaging perspective. Okay, so the main classroom exercise sounds something like this. Observing from the code switching perspective, in simple sentences, describe what the speaker just did using as many of the concepts as you can to interpret what is happening. The next step, let's go to the other side of the mountain. Observing from the translanguaging perspective. In simple sentences, describe what the speaker did using as many concepts as you can from the translanguaging perspective. Now, towards the beginning, students say really obvious things. They describe really obvious things, but then they tend to get deeper and deeper pretty quickly. So maybe try collecting them on the whiteboard as they're yelling them out to you or whatever. Now, the first time that I do this exercise, I'll add another metaphor to the discussion. I call it the tight family metaphor. I might say something like, you can assess what I'm doing from this perspective or from this perspective. Just remember, we are using a different family of concepts, and each family, they're like this. Each family member, each concept supports one another. So each side represents a tight family of concepts. For example, the concept second language, or L2, depends on the concept first language, or L1, because how can you have the concept of a second language without having the concept of the first language? And remember, each family will interpret that mountain very differently because they see the world differently. And then I'll also say something like, oh, and remember those 5 assertions, those 5 assumptions about the code switching perspective that we've been learning about all semester? Those numbered points underneath, you gotta make sure that whatever you say doesn't conflict with those. Those are like the house rules, the family house rules. Okay, so let me model what this exercise might look like in front of a class and the kinds of answers you might expect to start coming in after a while. I'll say something like, okay class, analyze what I say from the code switching perspective. That party was awesome, pero muy crowded. Students usually start pretty simple and then start upping the stakes over time. The observations might sound something like this. From the code switching perspective, middle school Mike is using his linguistic repertoire that has been split or divided into 2 codes or 2 grammars. Mike has been institutionally categorized by his school as a bilingual. Mike is code switching between 2 named languages. One language named English and one language named Spanish. We know that middle school Mike's first language, or L1, is the language named English. We can say that the English language linguistic features Mike used included the words, "The party was awesome," and also the word crowded. These words have been institutionally and historically assigned to the language named English. The words, or linguistic features, pero muy, have been institutionally and historically assigned to the language named Spanish. And that's it. Simple statements, almost robotic statements, and everything just stated or interpreted or observed was correct from within the code switching perspective. But how will students know if they are correct? Well, if you look at the 5 numbered assertions underneath, anything said can't conflict. For example, the number 1 tells you that the code switching perspective comes with pre-made institutional concepts like L1 and L2. So it is totally quote unquote correct to say that. However, from the translanguaging perspective, from the other side of the mountain, that first assertion says that the translanguaging perspective, translanguaging pedagogies, actively try to undermine concepts like L1 and L2. So that means we gotta adjust what we say to hold true to these different 5 assertions when we go to the other side of the mountain. And I'll remind them, you gotta phrase what you say in such a way that doesn't break the house rules. In other words, I'm telling them they're gonna have to qualify their statements in order to make them hold true. For example, and continuing the exercise, I'll say, let's flip to the translanguaging perspective and practice from there. Again, let's analyze. That party was awesome, pero muy crowded. Okay, from the translanguaging perspective, it can be said that middle school Mike is using his linguistic repertoire that remains undivided by named languages. Additionally, named languages, or individual languages, do not technically exist on this side from the translanguaging perspective. This means that Mike is deploying all the language he knows to communicate from his unified linguistic repertoire, where he is selecting and combining linguistic features using everything that he knows. So, okay, cool, but we are still in beginner mode. We can't just stop there. But if you look at the drawing, there appears to be way less keywords and concepts on the translanguaging side. So how do we keep going? How do we keep describing when we got less stuff to work with? Plus, what if I work at a school or something and I need to use the concept L1 or L2 to say anything meaningful? I can't just stop at middle school Mike is using his unified linguistic repertoire. And here I'll just tell students all you gotta do is borrow keywords from the other side and then add qualifications. It's that simple. Admittedly, it's not simple. We're in hard mode now. And again, I remind students, anything that you say cannot conflict with the 5 house rules underneath. So word yourself carefully. Eventually, answers start to sound like, if we borrow the names of languages from the code switching perspective, we can now say that Mike is selecting linguistic features from his unified linguistic repertoire, but at the same time, those features have been institutionally assigned to either the concept named English or the concept named Spanish. Now, why use the phrase, the concept named English? Well, because technically, individual grammatically bound languages as autonomous entities, those don't exist on the translanguaging side. But we can call it the concept named English as opposed to the language named English. The concept named English, that won't conflict with any of the 5 assertions. Why? Because even the concept, a language, is a pre-made category. Even English is a pre-made category. So we actually can't call it a language when we're on the translanguaging side. But maybe we can still describe it as a grouping of linguistic features we historically constructed and assigned to the concept named English. Don't worry, in the next section, in chapter 2 of this video, I'll show you how I get students to actually either say or write these kinds of things for me. Now, if I set up the class correctly, the students aren't trying to make each approach fight. nor are they trying to make them similar. They're really just focused on understanding them as super different perspectives, but at a nuanced level. And this is so helpful for those terms that have totally different meanings depending on which perspective you're actually using. In fact, let me highlight one of those terms, a major source of confusion. The phrase language user. It took me a while to figure out how deeply this was confusing people. And this is why. If we said the sentence, Mike is a language user, okay, simple enough, but the term language user means totally different things from each perspective because the concept language has different understandings on each side. Now, from the code switching side, saying Mike is a language user or a bilingual language user, that will very likely be interpreted as Mike is a bilingual language user of two separate languages. However, from the translanguaging perspective, the term language user is talking about something way different. On the translanguaging side, we are referring to the language user that deploys all of their language, meaning their unified linguistic repertoire, the sum total of everything a person knows about communicating. Those are two very different definitions of the very common term language user. I totally recommend you clarify that hard, like at the beginning, because it can bring a world of headaches later on. Now, to avoid this particular difficulty, when talking from the translanguaging perspective, I would recommend that everyone switch to exclusively using the verb languaging to refer to language that is being used, and also to start calling Mike a languager as opposed to a language user. That tiny change really helped the larger class move forward much quicker. Now again, at this point, I'm not trying to politicize anything yet, not yet. Students are simply interpreting through two parallel perspectives. So it is correct to say something like, Mike is a languager that communicates via languaging when we are using the translanguaging approach. And it is also correct to say, from the code switching perspective, flipping the page, right? Mike is a bilingual language user that communicates by speaking through two individual named languages, English and Spanish. Both sets of statements are correct or hold true from within their own perspective. Both sets of statements follow the 5 house rules on each side. So not only am I avoiding putting the theories into conflict too early, I'm also avoiding accidentally making the approaches seem too similar. So by the end of the semester, and after several weeks of flipping back and forth, it really stops making sense to even try to make them seem similar. Last thing about those 5 assertions on each side. The number 1s on both sides are related to one another. The number 2s on both sides are related to one another, and so on. Again, none of the observations that we make can break these house rules, so word carefully. These numbered points are designed to force you to think very carefully about whether or not a concept exists in the same way on both sides. And they also provide some general parameters, some guardrails, so you don't accidentally say something totally crazy by accident. Okay, so that was the general breakdown of how I use this cheat sheet in the classroom. Now, I told you earlier, my first secret to understanding this stuff is thinking about translanguaging and code switching as parallel theories, not one on top of the other that make them fight for dominance, nor do I present them as overlapping in some way that suggests that they're similar. I really just find it so useful presenting them as parallel, as side by side, both saying different things that are true from their own way of seeing the world. But quite honestly, this illustration, this chart, is a relatively small part of my approach. The main part, the giant part, is how I set up the class to actually use this diagram. And here we arrive at chapter 2 of this video. Okay, so in this second section of the video, we are going to get really advanced really fast, because this part is for educators teaching translanguaging theory. I'm going to suggest you place one super traditional translanguaging reading in an unusual spot. And the best way to do this is to just tell you where I position this reading in my own courses. And more importantly, why I think it should be positioned there. So let's talk about the larger structure of the course and how this diagram fits into that. So I treat my course on bilingual theory and practice as the department's flagship course on translanguaging pedagogy. I don't know if it is, but I force myself to treat it that way because it makes me want to get as theoretically intense and nuanced as possible, as though this were the last course they will ever take on translanguaging. And unfortunately, that is actually the case for some students. When first developing this class, I looked at dozens and dozens of syllabi, both from more traditional approaches to more progressive and radical ones. I was searching for an order to the readings that made sense to me. Now, in my heart, I am a high school teacher, so I was looking for a logical step-by-step scaffolding style approach to teaching this stuff. But I noticed something about many of these syllabi. Very generally, they introduced the entire theory at the same time in the very first few classes, kind of like a broad overview, right? And then over the following weeks, students are kind of expected to work their way out of the theoretical weeds, while also trying to differentiate translanguaging from code-switching pedagogies. And I also noticed that many of these syllabi don't emphasize, and some don't even mention, that code-switching pedagogies come with their very own, very developed hegemonic theories of language. Now, I tried this syllabus structure exactly one time and never again. It's just too much to hold in your head at the beginning when you're learning this stuff. Let's talk about how I structure my course. Now, on a basic level, I divide the larger course into thirds, and I spend the first 2/3 of the course dedicated to grasping all the keywords and concepts, as well as the politics and the philosophies and the theory of language that is embedded within the code-switching perspective. Only the code-switching perspective. So yes, the whole first 2/3 of my course is dedicated to understanding code-switching pedagogies and what constitutes a language from the code-switching perspective. That means only 1/3 of the semester is explicitly dealing with translanguaging theory. And that doesn't sound like a lot of time, right? Well, I can tell you this. If your students know these 5 numbered assertions and assumptions, if they know those from the code-switching perspective, they are really only one tiny step away from being able to just guess what's on the translanguaging perspective. You see, each numbered assertion is kind of mirrored on the other side, but just a little inverted or qualified. So I guess I kind of exaggerated when I said that I don't teach translanguaging stuff for the first 2/3 of the course. In actuality, I'm just covertly teaching them things the whole time. But there is one main thing that I do quite explicitly that's different in my teaching, and it has to do with the idea of the named language. Now, we know that the idea of the named language, as well as the idea of disinvention from Macaulay and Pennycook, we know these ideas are crucial to translanguaging theory. In most of the syllabi that I saw, that Macaulay and Pennycook reading was usually assigned during the opening week of translanguaging theory. After all, it's one of the most crucial readings to the whole dang thing. And here is my second big secret. I assigned this reading weeks and weeks before translanguaging theory. Like, way before. A lot of freaking weeks, okay? So what's the rationale behind this decision? Well, this practice was also inspired by that exact same video of Ofelia Garcia, specifically where she talks about when she adopted the named language idea from Macaulay and Pennycook. So let's watch.
I must say that to me, the watershed moment was when I read Simfrey Macauley's and Alistair Pennycook's The Disinvention of Language. Macaulay had asked me to write the foreword, and when I read that book, I thought, oh my God, what have I been missing out of all of this? And I thought, okay, well.
Okay, so when I saw this, I wondered, wow, what would have happened if the named languages concept had been developed like 10 years earlier? Like Ophelia would have had her watershed moment like 10 years before, right? Like where would we be now? It's fun to think about. But then I thought, maybe if my students learn about this concept much, much earlier in the semester, maybe their learning of translanguaging theory would change. That was my idea, that simple. Turns out that was an excellent decision. Now, if you have read the Disinventing Named Languages chapter, and if you have assigned that chapter before to your students, then you already know that students think that chapter is really boring. I mean, if you ain't into history, it could be. Plus, it's really complex and super long. On top of that, the very idea that languages are historical, political constructions used to dominate marginalized populations, that whole premise is huge in itself, and it takes a little bit of time for students to accept that idea. After all, we might remember that every single student walks into class with their own deeply internalized theories of language, hegemonic ones at that. So I think in general, we might be underestimating how long it takes to accept the idea of the named language. Also, one big advantage to introducing the named languages idea super early on is that the code switching pedagogies actually utilize named languages, and they don't question the status of named languages. So it's almost easy to incorporate the concept at that point. After all, at that point, we are only trying to accept the idea that languages are political inventions. We ain't trying to disinvent anything yet. Right now, we are just seeing how those political inventions that we call named languages, how they operate in places like a school or a classroom or a piece of language policy. It makes the idea of named languages as real as possible, which then makes them so much easier to deconstruct later on in the semester. And here I'll tell you a terminology trick that I use. And this starts a few weeks before I even utter the word translanguaging. I have students begin using the entire phrase, the concept named English, or the concept named Spanish, every single time that they're referring to a specific language. Yes, every single time while speaking in class and also in the written assignments. Yes, it is annoying to the point of parody, but also that's part of the point. It begins to denaturalize the concept language. Over time, after saying this whole phrase over and over and over again, those individual named languages, they start feeling like a regular basic concept. Why do I want this? Well, what I'm doing is I'm trying to conceptually demote English and Spanish down and away from the status of a fully formed individual language. And I want to start doing this work long before arriving at translanguaging. I am trying to present English and Spanish as just another concept. Just like any other concepts. Nothing to see here, nothing divinely granted by nature, nothing that you need a PhD in neuroscience to understand. The underlying message is simple and blunt. Individual languages are merely human-made social inventions, just like any other social construction. To be clear, I'm not necessarily making that claim out loud, nor do I actually believe that language is just like any other concept, but I position individual languages like that for two reasons. First, I want students to feel less intimidated about the concept language. And second, I want them to feel a little bit less sure about what language actually is. I'm explicitly attempting to soften various common language ideologies that have had an entire lifetime to harden, including all the folk theories of language that students walk into the classroom with. And one final note about the Macaulay and Pennycook reading. Now, I noticed that students really understood the metaphorical idea that just the way Christopher Columbus invented America, we can say that historical actors like colonists invented named languages for the purpose of governing and dominating certain populations. When this article is assigned super early in the semester like that, I think about 4 out of 5 students will not understand what it means to disinvent language. But so long as they grasp the idea that languages are really just like any other invented concept, that's really my goal at the beginning of the semester. But why? Because at the end of the semester, all I gotta say is, hey, remember all of that talk about disinventing languages? Can you see how translanguaging pedagogy kind of makes us reinvent or reimagine how language and so-called language users exist? You can literally see it click on their face sometimes, like the, oh my God, I get it now kind of face. And by the end of the semester, I would bet that 4 out of 5 of those same students, whether they're graduate students or undergraduate students, I would bet that they could pick up that Macaulay and Pennycook reading again and actually really understand it. Okay, let's close up. In chapter 1 of this video, I spent a whole lot of time depoliticizing the code switching and translanguaging approaches for pedagogical purposes, especially when I suggest that you can present them as 2 parallel theories, as if they were politically neutral, as just seeing different things, as though they're just standing on different sides of the mountain without a care in the world. Using this illustration is essentially the only time that politics drops out of view in my courses, only during the time where we're running through the exercise. Again, I'm not saying this is the right way to teach this stuff. It's just the Mike way to teach this stuff. With that said, if you're a teacher, I invite you to change whatever you need to change on this illustration. Make this chart work for you and not give you more work. Add in stuff, take out stuff, present concepts individually or in groups, etc., etc. You know what your class needs, and this illustration is meant to be as simple and as widely applicable as possible. So do what you gotta do. You do you. Well, that's all for today, folks. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You can find this illustration and all of my publications on academia.edu or on my website, maestromikemena.com. Once again, this is Mike with The Social Life of Language, and we're done.